Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to RadiOdyssey 50 Years of Space, or as we like to call it these days, RadiOdyssey DYT, direct to YouTube. I am K1 and have my esteemed panel here, a large panel like last time, which is really awesome. Always by my side is my buddy Raiderman and my other buddy Dancing Crow. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
Good evening.
And some other esteemed gentlemen from Mad 6. We've got Headshot.
Yep.
Tim G.
Hey, what's up?
Gavantar.
What's up?
And Z-Snipe.
Have a good day, everybody.
And I'd also like to give a few shout-outs to those who have been loyal and devoted to my program for all this time. I appreciate everything, particularly the esteemed ladies and gentlemen from the Star Trek International Fan Association, specifically the Long Beach Correspondence Chapter, USS Stephen Hawking. I appreciate all of the support and the enthusiasm and the sharing. Also, I'd like to give a very special shout out to a very special friend, the very lovely Carnivore Queen. Love you as always. I must apologize for a program we'd actually recorded last week that will not be going up because, like an idiot, I had the voice audio too low and the game audio too high, and we couldn't hear him.
Oh no.
Yeah, so that's bad. I'm sorry. Sorry, Carnivore Queen. Cammy. I'm sorry. I have another shout out. There is someone on YouTube who has been a rather regular commenter. I apologize if I'm butchering your name, good sir. Antonin Matthew, who has always seemed most interested in the Kerbal Space Program space history videos I've put up. He has a question recently, and thank you guys for getting back to him on that with regards to how we record from game as such. It was a program called Open Broadcaster, and there was a link. I'm actually going to go ahead and post the link in the comment section below in this video. And like last time, any images that we reference or anything we talk about visually, I'll have up on the video for all to see.
And
Phew.
for the record, why have we not been releasing new episodes of Kerbal Odyssey?
For the record, because of the recent update in Kerbal Space Program has added quite a bit of lag, and in the videos where I've been building and expanding upon the International Space Station, it's reduced my frame rate to about 4 frames per second. Wow. That doesn't really make for good viewing.
And even the mission videos themselves we were noticing a frame rate drop. We're talking the videos without the ISS, for the record.
They wouldn't be too bad, and I might get back to something on that, but I'd like to actually complete something that I start without starting something new again, because I've kind of started 5 new things, so I'd like to actually complete something for once. Today happens to be May the 30th, 2016. It is Monday. It is Memorial Day. And in honor of Memorial Day, we will spend some time talking about the esteemed ladies and gentlemen, the true heroes of the space program who had given their lives for the program on both hemispheres, not just NASA, but on Russian side as well. These guys are every bit as heroic as anyone you can name, and they gave of their lives willingly.
Keep in mind that we had a lot of test pilots be the forefront in astronaut technology, or astronaut candidates.
Space travel.
Early on, the pioneers.
Yeah, the pioneers, the candidates. These people had the mentality of, well, there's 10 seconds left to save this craft, not 10 seconds left to live. There was these people had, forgive my French, the balls to go up there and solve any problem applicable at the situation and come down in one piece, whether or not they succeeded. But we support and we love to rival in everybody's triumph or effort in doing this.
The unfortunate part of that is the fact that when test pilots risk their lives, nobody cares. It's just their 9-to-5 job, and they just do it. And yet, when something serious happens in spaceflight, every time something serious happens, it becomes a question of, oh my God, why are we wasting lives and money for this? Flying in general is a dangerous business, and we've become very complacent in it because we've done so well and made flight so, shall we say, commercially available that we don't realize every time a new flying vehicle is made, especially something that has some new advancement, somebody's got to test it, not knowing whether or not the darn thing is going to fall apart from under them.
Yes, and these people, they went wholeheartedly trusting all advancements in technology at the time, and I would do the same, just to be a part of this group. But these people did everything we have not done. As you and I, everybody else here sitting at the round table, everybody else sitting at home, we have not done. These people dared their lives, and through success, through failures, there are success.
I'm actually going to start with that. Did a quick search on a list of fatalities from aviation accidents. Now, some of these men and women might have been test pilots, some might have not. So I'm sure it's a Trivial Pursuit question. Who was the first person to ever lose their life in an aviation accident? And it looks like in 1785, a gentleman from France, in a hot air balloon, not actually a fixed-wing aircraft, crashed in an attempt to fly across the English Channel. Not sure if I'm good at pronouncing this. Is that Francois?
Yes, his name is Jean-Francois Pelletier de Rosière.
Oh, damn. Dude, you're going to become my official pronunciator. So yes, flight was a dangerous business even back when it was just hot air balloons. And looks like the first 3 are all from France and all hot air balloon.
Yes, all lighter than aircraft.
And the first of the United States would be a Thomas Selfridge. First powered airplane fatality, first military aviation fatality, first passenger fatality, and is the namesake of Selfridge Field. Let's see, where is that specifically? Selfridge Air National Guard Base in Harrison Township, Michigan, named after this gentleman who lost his life in aviation. Apparently, the right propeller had failed. U.S. Army Signal Corps contract acceptance trial flight piloted by Orville Wright, who was seriously injured. Oh, goodness, this was one of the Wright brothers. So Thomas Selfridge was a passenger on a plane that Orville Wright was flying when it failed. That takes it all the way back to the darn beginning.
Now let's keep in mind, this is the very early beginning. There was no testing involved. This was all experimental. Everything was on the cusp. There was no going back. There was no safety procedures implemented. This was
Forgive
discovery.
my phrasing, but this was balls to the walls flying.
Which brings up another interesting point. We've progressed so far in aviation, and yet we don't realize that the actual science of flight, the actual practice of human flight, is only 113 years old. 1903.
All right, let's take that into retrospective. The history of vehicle transportation. And we have not achieved vehicles that have no fuel consumption. Yet we can go to the moon. We can go to Mars. We can go to, what's the point? James Webb Telescope.
Oh, the Lagrange point.
Okay. We can go to the Lagrange point with a telescope in 2018.
We have sent a high-speed probe all the way out to fracking Pluto.
And beyond.
Yeah, it will eventually catch up to Voyager 1 and 2. Or it'll catch up to their distance. It won't actually catch up to where they are because they're all going in different directions.
But given the history where we've been, what we've discovered, this is the educational series of our progression through aviation into space flight.
Thankfully, spaceflight isn't as, shall we say, commercially monopolizing. Like, not to where a single group can take sole control over it that it stagnates it. And that's the one problem I see with automotive transportation, is we're still using basically the same technology we've been using for the past 50 years. Hasn't progressed a great deal with regards to the internal combustion engine, and yet we still maintain that type of hardware and technology simply because the fuels that we use for it are in the hands of a select few that hold such power financially over the world.
Yes, greater shares in the oil companies, but also I believe that the human populace is a little bit brainwashed in the fact that let's stick with something we know instead of going on with further technology that is based, that is proven.
The money-making framework that's been set up throughout the past 100 years.
Let's go with something we know. Let's continue on with that and just try and climb another ladder rung up. But there is other technology out there that we could step onto a new ladder.
Which is one of the complaints I've been hearing about NASA's new spacecraft, the Orion, in how it looks like we're going back to what we know, or just making a new Apollo. Which actually, if you look beyond just the external shape, that is decidedly not true. There is almost no real similarity between the Orion command module multi-purpose crew vehicle and the Apollo command module, except for the fact that they're cone-shaped, which makes sense because the cone shape is the most efficient design for a rocket-propelled spacecraft. That being said, anytime there is a new vehicle, they still have to test it extensively, and no matter how much testing you do with automated systems, you still have to eventually put a man inside it and fly it. You just hope that you have everything ironed out before you do so, which is why I think the testing for Orion is taking so long, because they really want to make sure everything is worked out properly before they start risking human lives, which is what they unfortunately, or what they're learning from, but unfortunately didn't know at the time of both Apollo and Soyuz, as the first craft on both of those suffered the first fatalities in human spaceflight.
And what were the reasons for those fatalities?
Well, in the end, the reasons were about the same for both
fever.
the United States and Soviet Union. There was political pressure to meet deadlines. There was cutbacks in budget. There was such pressure to meet these deadlines that they never really stepped back to look at the data. They were trying to get everything done so quickly that it wasn't a matter of seeing what data was gathered from the test, but just making sure you get all the tests done. It's like, we have to do all these things, we have to do them in this order, and we have to do them by this point, otherwise we're going to skip the launch. What was that?
Called Go Fever.
Yes, Go Fever. I believe Wally Schirra pointed that out as other inputs that make you do things beyond the good logic you have. It's where you're so focused on you're so end goal oriented that you get tunnel vision on it and you don't see what's around you.
Unfortunately, that plagued the space program, but fortunately, we've learned from our mistakes.
And since we are here to honor those who did give their lives for the program, the first astronauts to lose their lives in a spacecraft were in fact American astronauts. and that would be the crew of Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. I say a spacecraft and not a space flight because it was a fire that started inside the spacecraft during what they called the plugs out test, where they remove all of the umbilical connections to the spacecraft, run it on its own internal power, while at the same time running a second test, and that is I'm forgetting what it's called. It's basically a pressure test. They ramp up the pressure inside to basically simulate the positive pressure of spaceflight to where there's at least 5 psi difference from inside and outside. And since this test was conducted in Florida at sea level, where the external pressure is already 14.8, they've had to ramp that spacecraft full of at least 17 pounds per square inch, and the atmosphere was not oxygen-nitrogen, it was pure oxygen.
That was the big mistake. Pure oxygen with a floor full of Velcro.
Well, not just the Velcro. The adhesive that they'd attached the Velcro to the walls was flammable. There was big sponge foam pads inside the cabin that were highly combustible. There wasn't proper insulation on the electrical wires. There wasn't proper procedures to make sure that they were secure and away from any panel doors. And not just the Velcro, but there was actually a memo by the program manager Joseph Shea that there was to be no more than 500 square inches of Velcro in the cabin and at least 10 inches between it and any electrical source. Well, even with this memo, they did not remove any of the over 5,000 square inches of Velcro. And one may ask, why so much Velcro? Well, you figure when stuff's floating around in space, or when you're floating in 0G, everything's floating around the cabin. You put a little Velcro on your pen, some on the wall, stick it, and boom, it stays there. So that was actually there on the astronauts' request. But while the contractor for the Apollo Command Module, North American Aviation, should have put more pressure to removing it, they did not.
Now, what sparked off the initial flame?
I mentioned the not proper procedures to make sure the electrical wires were away from any panel doors and such. Just below the commander's seat in the left of the spacecraft, behind a panel door that had opened and closed a few times, a section of wire had frayed Teflon insulation in 2 parts. Basically, the insulation had stripped free on 2 parts of the wire. When the electrical current went through the wire, there was an arc that created a spark, and this spark landed inside the cabin. Well, normally you think of a spark, it lights and then fizzles out. Well, this is an atmosphere of pure oxygen at high pressure. So this spark sat there and just glowed and intensified.
It was like dropping a match into a pile of gasoline. It went off.
Yeah, it just stayed there and continued to glow brighter and brighter until something around it combusted. They're not sure if it was the nylon netting under a seat or a patch of Velcro, but once something sparked and erupted in a flame, everything around it did too.
Very unfortunate.
The one piece of good news in all of this is that their pressure suits, which were designed to deflect extreme heat, had held. They were not burned alive. But what did happen is their suit hoses were not insulated in the same way. So the fire melted through their air intake hoses, and the toxic fumes of the smoke got into their suits and they asphyxiated.
They suffocated.
Yes. Even after they got the hatch open 5 minutes later, their suits were still white. And they were found actually maintaining proper procedures. Roger Chaffee, who was his position was called pilot, in the right-hand seat, was still strapped to his seat to maintain voice communication with the launch control. Ed White, in the center seat, as senior pilot, had left his seat and started to begin procedures to open the hatch. Now, he could not do so because even at the normal testing pressure, the internal hatch opened inward So here you're trying to pull against the pressure inside, which you couldn't do anyway, which is why Grissom, who was in the left-hand seat as the command pilot, had left his seat and was in the lower bay to activate the purge valve to bleed the pressure out. He could not complete this procedure in time, and even if he could, it wouldn't have made any difference, because the fire had increased the pressure so great that the hull of the spacecraft had actually breached.
Through the loss of these great men, we've learned something. We do not do 100% atmosphere in a rocket launch.
There are actually several things that changed after this. One, during launch, the atmosphere is sea level pressure, oxygen, nitrogen. During ascent, that pressure is bled out into the 5 psi pure oxygen environment, but 5 psi is not as much of a danger. You still don't want fire, but it's not as catastrophic. The reason why the decision was made to go with pure oxygen in the first place is so you wouldn't have to maintain a separate supply of gases in your spacecraft. You wouldn't need both an oxygen tank and a nitrogen tank, which would add size and weight to your craft. By limiting the pressure to just oxygen, you save a great deal of weight, a great deal of complexity. But the trade-off is, of course, what happened here.
Flammability of the entire craft, yeah.
In addition, more procedures were added to make sure that all, not only wires, but electrical circuits had additional insulation. This became a question on the Apollo 13 mission when so much condensation had gathered on the panels because of the cold, clammy environment when they had to shut everything off, that they were worried about when they started reactivating the command module if it would cause any short circuits. But because of the additional insulation and the additional safety measures that were added to the spacecraft systems because of the Apollo 1 fire, this gathered condensation was not a problem.
Ergo, we learned from our experiences, and fortunately, we lost very good men, but we progressed forward.
One thing that the Soviet spacecraft, however, do is the mixed gas environment, which was why the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, where they docked the Apollo, as they called it, even though it was technically Apollo 18, with Soyuz 19, they had to have that special adapter module to where they could close one spacecraft and equalize with the other, as the Apollo still ran with pure oxygen and the Soyuz still ran with oxygen-nitrogen. Even so, that did not save the other spaceflight disaster the same year when Vladimir Komarov had lost his life in Soyuz 1, actually during spaceflight.
And what actually happened?
Well, the causes were the same. It was still the rush schedule. In this case, whereas on Apollo's end, it was a rush to meet Kennedy's deadline, on Russia's end, it was a rush to have a big space triumph on the anniversary of Vladimir Lenin's birthday. With Apollo, a lot of the problems were either not reported or not as noticed. With Soyuz, they were. There were over 200 openly stated engineering problems with the craft, and the engineers made darn sure they were aware of it, but the Politburo just kind of shrugged them off. It's also noted that the backup for Soyuz 1 was Yuri Gagarin, who was the first man in space. He and Komarov knew that there were so many problems with the craft that it was a death trap. Gagarin's plan, which was a brilliant plan, by the way, was to basically find some way to prove Komarov unfit and bump him from the flight so that Gagarin would take his seat, knowing that they would never, or that they would take the problems more seriously because they would never want to risk the life of this national hero. Nor should they, right? But at the same time, what Gagarin didn't anticipate was Komarov, who also knew all these problems and would not want to risk the life of Gagarin, so he fought the attempt to bump him from the flight every step of the way because he didn't want to see his friend and national hero die in that manner. But even so, unlike Apollo, Soyuz 1 did launch and make orbit. Granted, everything that could have went wrong did. One of the solar wings would not deploy. The guidance system malfunctioned. The attitude control system malfunctioned. The manual control system malfunctioned. The half of the thrusters weren't working. The spacecraft ended up in a spin that couldn't be corrected. And just everything, problem after problem after problem after problem.
The only thing that was actually functioning at that point was the pilot.
Indeed. And they did have a separate plan to actually launch their second Soyuz, which was the original flight plan of Soyuz 1 was to launch it first, and then launch Soyuz 2 with a 3-man crew, transfer 2 over to Soyuz 1, and then land them both separately. So to perform the first ever manned rendezvous and docking, first ever crew transfer from one vehicle to another. So it would have set an unprecedented number of space firsts on this important day for the Soviet Union. But with all these problems, they obviously couldn't do that. So they decided to change their plan and use Soyuz 2 as a rescue vehicle. Leave one of the cosmonauts behind and save that third seat for Komarov so they could rescue him and bring him back. Or first see if they could manually deploy the other solar wing and save the mission. Well, that didn't happen, as there was an electrical storm in Baikonur at the time, which fried the electrical systems of Soyuz 2 so they couldn't launch, which is actually a good thing they did, or good thing that happened, because what happened next would have happened to them too. Even with all the problems that were going on, Komarov had actually managed to bring the spacecraft through re-entry safely, with malfunctioning thrusters, only partially effective manual control, and only the view out the window to guide him. But the damn parachute wouldn't work.
Oh.
They shoehorned a increased sized parachute into the pre-existing sized parachute stowage, and I do mean shoehorned.
The whole reason for that, at that point, not a single Soyuz test flight was successful. And the last one that had flown came in a little steep to the point that it actually burned a hole through the heat shield. The craft survived, but no crew member would have. So they thickened the heat shield, which added more weight to the craft, which means they needed a larger parachute. But they did not increase the size of the containment pod for it.
Do we see where this is going?
So the main parachute did not properly deploy, twisted up like a washcloth being wrung out. He cut the main chute free and deployed the reserve chute, but the main chute didn't fully deploy, so the reserve got caught in it and didn't deploy either.
At which point he probably knew he was going to die.
I'm not sure how factually accurate this is. There were published reports at the time that U.S. listening posts actually intercepted transmissions in which you could hear Komarov screaming, not in like agony or terror, but screaming in anger, quote, cursing the engineers and politicians who put him in such a botched spaceship, unquote, before he hit the ground.
Well, factually accurate or not, who wouldn't?
And as I mentioned, it's a good thing that Soyuz 2 didn't fly, because it also had the enlarged heat shield, also had the enlarged parachute, and also did not have an enlarged parachute compartment. So it likely would have suffered through the same problem that Soyuz 1 would have, even if it didn't suffer through the bad guidance system, the bad thrusters, the bad solar wings. So this could have been potentially a whole lot worse. We could have lost 3 instead of 1.
They would have killed their program.
Not necessarily, because they've hid problems before. But if it was Yuri Gagarin on that flight, there's no way they would have been able to hide that, because Gagarin was known worldwide. if Russia did, or if the Soviet people didn't raise up against the government for that decision at that point, other nations would have, including America, I'd think. And there was no, haha, you guys failed. One of the first things that happened after the crash was Deke Slayton, who was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts and the director of flight crew operations, who basically gave out the flight assignments. He decided who flew what mission. So it was him who put Gus, Ed, and Roger in Apollo 1. First thing he did after they got the news was to make a press conference, or not a press conference, but make an announcement expressing his and NASA's sympathies for the loss of the kindred pilot and pioneer.
At that point, it wasn't about governments or politicians or diplomats. It was from science agency to science agency, which is how it should be.
On a small tangent a bit on that same subject you just said, there's actually an incident in Apollo 11, when we made it to the moon, that Russia had actually intended to send an unmanned probe first to land on the moon, gather samples, and return them to Earth before the Apollo 11 crew could, so they could have the distinction of having the first physical samples from the moon before America did. But this probe, I believe it was Luna 15, had actually suffered a telemetry failure during descent in which they lost control over it and could not regain control before it impacted the lunar surface. What makes this interesting is that Russia had actually informed America of this flight, I believe, so there wouldn't be any conflict during transit because they were both going to the moon at the same time. So they didn't want it to appear as if there was a missile going toward Apollo 11 or for it to be mistaken as something else, or so they don't accidentally collide, which is highly unlikely. But what also didn't happen was there was no gloating. Granted, America could have jumped up and said, haha, look at your failure, you crashed on the moon while we made it. No, NASA said nothing of it. They let Russia save face and continue their program as they saw fit. America at large knew nothing of this. So that is the camaraderie of science and exploration. It doesn't matter what your government says. Those who are doing the science, doing the exploring, doing the flying, to them, that's all that matters.